I join Brian in welcoming all of you, new faces as well as old familiar faces, to this second annual Michigan Map Society lecture sponsored by the Clark Library and the Clements Library. And it gives me particular pleasure tonight to introduce Susan Schulten, who's a friend of mine and a colleague in that rather small world of the history of cartography. We've known each other for quite a while. I've heard Susan lecture a number of times. I've always been impressed with what she does and the command of her subject and the great joy and enthusiasm she brings to it. So I'll just say one or two things about her, and then we want to get to the subject at hand. She's a professor of history and chair of the Department of History at the University of Denver. Her background is from her BA at the California, Berkeley, and PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in history. She's the author of two books that you've seen out on the stand, the Literati stand, which I highly recommend. If you haven't bought one now, you want to race to that stand after the lecture. Mapping the Nation and Geographical Imagination in America. Susan does that rare thing as a historian of really bringing together the visual sources with the information of American history. And not just visual resources that we use today, but how people in the 19th century viewed their world and understood their world through maps, which are one of the great windows to history. We know that Ortelius called geography the eye of history, and it's something that it does us all good to remember. A testimony to the quality of the work that she does is that she's been a Guggenheim Fellow. She's been a public scholar for the National Endowment for the Humanities. She's written articles for the New York Times and the New Republic, and she's just recently finished a book that I think you'll all enjoy called A History of America in 100 Maps, published by Chicago in conjunction with the British Library, so bringing some real map treasures to all of us in a beautiful book. For all of you who are map enthusiasts, I will point out, too, that for her book, Mapping the Nation, one of its great features is that it has a website that accompanies it. I don't know about you, but it's very frustrating for me when you're reading a book and you're really interested in the maps in the book. The images are sometimes so small you can't see the details that you want to see on them. With Susan's website of Mapping the Nation, you can see the maps that are illustrated in the book in color and zoom in so you can look at them in detail, and it adds a whole other dimension to reading the book and understanding the book. So I highly recommend that aspect of the book too. So you can tell that Susan and I both share an enthusiasm for maps. I'm very much looking forward to her talk tonight on map drawing and graphic literacy in the early republic. Please join me in welcoming Susan Schulten.
It's going to take me a minute here. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. I want to tell you how honored I am to be here. I came in yesterday evening and spent the day in the Clements Library under the guidance of Mary and her incredible colleagues, and it was, I told someone in the foyer outside, it was wonderful and overwhelming at the same time. It's hard for me to convey to you. If you're used to the Michigan Clements Library, you may not quite realize the extraordinary depth of the collection, which I just, of course, skimmed very briefly today. But again, I want to thank you all for coming. And there's a couple of people I'd like to thank specifically for the invitation, especially Carl Longstreth and Mary Pedley. For making my entire visit so smooth. I'd like to thank Ann Bennington-Helber, Shanine Coldiron, Angela Unk, Jacob Dopp, and Emily Henke. Thank you all for being so kind to me and so Midwestern. That's a compliment. And I want to just say one or two things about Mary before I launch into this. You all know her, of course, as an assistant curator here at the Map Library, but I just want to give you a testament to what Mary means in my world and the stature she has in the history of cartography and the level of respect she commands from her colleagues in our tiny little world, admittedly. One small measure of that is the History of Cartography project, which is an unbelievably ambitious attempt to catalog in an encyclopedic fashion the history of humankind's attempt to map its surroundings. You may know, if you know the project, that several iterations have come out. The 20th century is out. The non-Western editions or world is out. Volume 5 on the 19th century is in progress. And Volume 4, which is the Enlightenment and the early modern period, is in press right now. And I'm sorry for the graininess of this image. I took it off the web. But that is Mary's baby. Mary has been working on this for 10 years. Is that fair? Co-edited with Matthew Edney. But we all know who really does the work. What you see in the middle is the manuscript pages that are now in production. And this is the most anticipated volume of the series for those of us who think so obsessively about the history of cartography. The Enlightenment, of course, is the pivot for all of this. And so I just want to convey to you what a treasure you have in Mary Pedley and how important she's been in my career as a role model and an inspiration and a beloved figure in our little community. So with that, I'm going to get started. You can give her a hand. The Clements Library, Brian Dunnigan tells me, about 5 years ago, like many archives around the country and private collectors, began to notice and purchase and buy up and snap up and steal off eBay a new kind of genre, a genre that had commanded very little attention over the last 50 years. I dare say that 50 years ago, there was not anyone in the United States or Britain or France who had any interest in the kind of maps I'm going to show you. What we're talking about here are primarily maps made in the new United States, but also Britain and France, between the end of the Revolution, so 1785, 1790 or so, to about the 1830s and 1840s. In that period, when the United States was, for the first time, coming into its own, an early republic in the most literal sense of that word, getting its grounding, developing its institutions, it was also doing something quite unusual, and that was insisting that its young women develop for the first time a formal education outside the home. I'm certainly not going to claim that the post-revolutionary era was the first time American women were being educated, but it is the case that they were rushing to educate their daughters outside the home and all across the country, but primarily in the Connecticut River Valley, with the epicenter in Massachusetts and in Connecticut. You had hundreds and hundreds of small schools, academies or seminaries as they were called, being founded, right? Some very, very tenuous that only lasted a few years for lack of students and enrollments, and some that became really important, the most important being Sarah Pierce's Litchfield Female Academy in Hartford, Connecticut, founded in 1792. And what I'm going to show you are the kinds of maps that became central to that new formal education for these young women in the United States. So I'm just going to flip through just to give you a sense of the kind of things we're talking about. If you were out in the lobby earlier, you saw some of the Clements' beautiful examples of these. Some made by men, most made by women, right? And then generally clustering between that 1790 and 1840 period, okay? And you begin to see patterns the more you look at them. So for me, I became obsessed with these maps about 5 to 7 years ago. And at first, I was really charmed by their folkloric quality, right? They're made by girls who are between 12 and 16 years old and boys about the same age. The more I began to find them in archives online, through dealers, right? Through private families, through school archives, the more you begin to see patterns. And the more you begin to see that these girls were doing certain kinds of things in these decades. What I want to spend the rest of my time here doing is to try to give you a sense of why these maps matter, more than just because they're charming and folkloric. They actually, if you look at them collectively, give us an unparalleled window onto the daily experience of young girls, the first generation to be formally educated in the United States. They also do something a little bit more. For someone like me, it's paramount. And that is, by the end of this talk, I hope to convince you that this visual culture, this graphic culture, generated some of the most important minds in American education. And they may have gone on to reject this as too traditional, too ornamental, not intellectual enough. But the women and some of the men themselves grew out of this tradition. And they brought with them into their own thinking and to the future of American education a highly visual understanding of how the mind works and how it retains information. So that's generally what I want to convince you of. Not only are these beautiful and intoxicating to look at and full of extraordinary detail and reflective of tremendous discipline, but they also mean something collectively for how we think about 19th century education, not just of women, but in general terms. Here's just one more slide to give you a sense of the variety that we're talking about. Most, but not all, of the United States, and many also of that double hemisphere, of the world that you've seen over and over. Okay? This is a tradition that is wholly inherited from Europe. There is nothing uniquely American about this. Okay? Here you have an atlas made by Frances Bowen under the care of her sister Eliza in the year 1810. Very typical in its timing, and also typical in the sense that in Britain, many of these girls were schooled at home. Here's a close-up to give you a sense of the exacting nature of it. You can see the degree to which young Frances is practicing very, very careful, precise outline and color and detail, and also, of course, penmanship. Right? And the fidelity of this to the original that she was copying was extraordinarily high. So they weren't necessarily tracing maps, but to a great degree, you'll see in some of these examples, these girls are what we might call copying maps. Okay? So this was a mainstay of education on both sides of the Atlantic by the year 1800. And Mary has actually taught me that these traditions of drawing maps, creating maps, cutting maps, goes way, way back, much earlier. So that's not the part that's unique or new. It's the way that it unfolds in the United States that I think is interesting, in part because there's so little backstory here. There's so little existing institutions. And so many of the ways in which this map drawing unfolds in the United States is different than the way it unfolds in Europe. And part of this has to do, there's not a lot of text slides, so this is just one of them. Part of it has to do with the particular regard for women's place in the world. I draw your attention to the British John Pinkerton, an atlas maker. Geography is a study so universally instructive and pleasing that it has, for nearly a century, been taught even to females. So, a universal and very revealing idea for geography being a quintessentially acceptable form of science. It's about the natural world, but it's not too hard, right? It's perfectly acceptable as a kind of discipline. There's a lot of memorization, right? What is it? Bays and, what's that old saying? Mountains and bays, right? But it tells you something about why geography became such a mainstay of American education. It was appropriate. It kept young women from idleness and gossip and all the other things that were of great concern as women began to move into the public sphere. Just as revealing is Emma Willard, who's very important to me. She's the most influential female educator in the United States in the 19th century. She is the second best-selling textbook author of the century, next to second only to Peter Parley. And Emma Willard was a young girl of about 22, when she took over the Middlebury Female Academy in 1816. And when she opened the academy, she had this to say: "If there is a class of human beings who ought to feel a devoted love of country, it is the female citizens of the Republic. The state of society, depending upon government and laws, affects far most the weaker sex. Man can rove, but woman cannot transplant herself from her native soil. She must wither or flourish, as that is bad or good." And I hope by the end of this talk you'll have a richer sense of what she was after there. For Willard, geography was the portal to citizenship, to memorization, to mental discipline, to all those things that she thought were so central to the way women could learn. She was constantly pushing the boundaries. Of course, the generation after her found her insufferably traditional, right? So I don't want to overdraw the case. But at the time, Emma Willard was constantly arguing, next to Middlebury College, which had just been opened, that her students were just as good as the guys down the street. And in fact, their recitations were usually better. And she was bitter about that, right? Middlebury College was educating some of the smartest men in the country, whereas her school couldn't even get wood for heat, right? Much less materials. But that pushing, that constant pushing for the mental capacity of women for her had a lot to do with the way women had to stay still, right? And the place they had in this new republic. To give you a sense of how quickly these schools flourish, I'll just give you one statistic that to me is quite revealing. In the 1810s alone, 9 schools were founded in the town of Hartford, Connecticut. 6 of those were for women only. From 1790 to 1830, 182 academies were founded for women and 14 seminaries. Okay? That's just in the beginning of these decades. By the 1830s and 40s, you have academies and seminaries being founded even on the frontier, especially in places like Ohio, Mississippi, right, which was then the frontier, of course. And essential to all of those was not just grammar, but geography. Here is a diploma from the Litchfield Female Academy, like I said, the most important institution for female education. And I've just zoomed in here to give you a sense not only of their sense of geography as central to enlightenment, right, and certainly very appropriate, right. Down here you have the young woman's name, has completed with honor the prescribed course of study, grammar, geography, history, etc. Right? That geography becomes fundamental, almost as fundamental to literacy as grammar itself. That's fallen off a little bit, I think, in the 20th century. But geography was considered a way for young women and young men to access all types of literacy in a way that we don't quite acknowledge anymore. The kind of maps that I've shown you and that you saw in the hallway were first and foremost demonstrations of a performance. That explains the level of care that was given to them. It explains what you'll see on many of them that I'll show you, fine silk borders or rollers, the fact that they've been preserved for generations. Here is a merit badge from that Litchfield Female Academy, and you can see that Julia Chittenden was considered the most deserving for the prize of merit. And then they say, the maps, paintings, and other pieces submitted for inspection are an honor to our school and a credit to the laudable emulation of the candidates. So within geography, which was fundamental to the curriculum, after about 1790, you have a subset of that, which is termed map drawing. And I think I have, yep, here's something from a curriculum from a school towards the end of my period, right? And you can see, it's quite interesting to me that, geography is here, almost always separate from map drawing. That is to say, geography is one thing and quite often just textual and descriptive. Map drawing emerges as sort of an adjunct or something separate from that. And by the 1830s, in the Boston Female Monitorial School, which was, again, one of the really stable and established schools, you can see map drawing becomes par for the course, right? Something very regular in this schooling. So what I'm trying to convey to you is how quickly map drawing in the United States, in these female academies, takes its place and becomes something that probably not for anyone younger than 10 or older than 17, but between them, a very common aspect of their education. I want to show you a couple examples of these that give you a sense of what we're looking at. The first is one that's very dear to my heart, and I'm sorry I didn't put the dimensions up here. This is a map made by a young woman named Emily Hill, and it is what we would consider a wall map, stitched, put together on 4 separate sheets of paper. You can see some of the seams, 4 irregular sheets of paper, because she didn't have access to much more. Let me show you a little bit more of a detail here to give you a sense of what she's doing. Look at the level of detail of the botanic art, right? You can see, look at the neat line. What I'm trying to draw your attention to is something that's going to become, I think, increasingly clear to you. Map drawing is only partially about geography. What you see here is a level of discipline and artistic execution, right, that has everything to do with the acceptable, what was then termed, accomplishments of women. 30 years earlier, that might have been primarily needlework, piano, and French, and drawing. Map drawing sort of takes its place on that. So in some ways, it's scientific, right, and it's sort of expanding women's minds, right? It's about geography. It's sort of about the world. But in other ways, it's very, very controlled and still very much about execution and artistry and accomplishment. That's the term that they would have used. So here's Emily Hill's cartouche. And here's a detail. Notice a couple things. The way in which the map is meant to resemble a professionally printed map, a commercially printed map, right? The fidelity and the delicacy, right, of detail. And then for me, what jumps out over and over again is the lettering. What they're practicing here, above all, is penmanship. And here you see Miss Emily Hill is using different hands for each of her states. There's lots of different calligraphic styles, apparently, right? And she was, I'll go back just to show you. It's difficult to see here, but she was practicing several different ones, right? We think, this is in the Osher Map Library in Maine, and the director of that library believes that given the size of this, Emily Hill was probably a teacher. That is to say, she wasn't necessarily a student, but someone who was doing what she could with the material she had to create materials for her students, right? And that's even more convincing when you step back and think that these maps, whether made by students or teachers, reach their height in the 20s and 30s. And then they fall off precipitously. There's a lot of reasons for that, but something that's really important here is that thereafter, it's really cheap to get atlases. But prior to that, it was not an easy thing in 1820. Is that where we are here? Yeah. In 1820, we don't have the mass market atlases yet of Morse and others. They'll be online in about 5 years. But it's still kind of a big deal for many of these small schools to have any of these texts in their curricula. Okay? That also explains why many of these are students who, even if they've dated their maps, they're copying maps from sometimes 20 or 30 years earlier, because that's what they had access to, right? And that also tells us that they're not necessarily primarily about geographic knowledge, that they're also about several other things. So I hope you get that sense here. Like I said, this is not just limited to girls. This is a map that you probably saw outside. It's off the rollers now, and this is for Kevin. There's a love of Vermont. This is young Melvin Wright in 1841, who drew an equally precise map of Vermont. He's from Londonderry. I think I have, yep. I know this is very difficult to see. Map of Vermont. You can see the way he's practicing his calligraphy. Projected by Melvin Wright, Londonderry. I don't know what that says. 10th, 1841. And if you go and take a look at, I don't think I have a detail of this one. But with the same precision, you can see that he's practicing his different calligraphic hands. The precision that he brings to the townships, right, of Vermont. And then the exquisite attention, even with the damage, that he's brought to the vignettes that he's copied from different textbooks. Okay? So the level of detail and the level of attention, what is clearly a term-long project, you think your term papers are bad, right? Or a year-long project. These are being undertaken not just by women, but primarily by young women, but men as well. My favorite example of this is young Caroline Chester, who I'm going to tell you a little bit about. Caroline Chester arrived at the Litchfield Female Academy, that important school that I mentioned earlier, in the summer of 1816, so right after the end of the War of 1812. She was 15 years old. And one thing she was taken with that we know about because she kept an exquisitely detailed diary is a map. I'll show you just a second. She writes down exactly the course of her studies every day, how much time she gives to Latin, to dancing, to piano, to mathematics, and to her map. And she tells us all this, and I think it'll shed light on something that you'll see. This is her map, completed in at the end of 1816. Okay? This is a hand-drawn map. It was obvious to me what she copied, because if you keep your eye on the screen, this is what she copied from. A map by Schulten and Kensit, which was one of the only maps of the United States printed during the War of 1812. So it was cheap, it was fairly easy to get a hold of, but it was also the only game in town. Schulten and Kensit made this, like I said, during the War of 1812. This is an 1813 copy. You can see the vignettes here of the various battles, which, according to this map, are going very well for the Americans. It wasn't exactly the case. But very much a patriotic map. And if you know anything about the early republic, you know that the War of 1812 unleashes this tremendous wave of patriotism and a real sense of American pride. I'm going to show you just the level of detail here. Here is Caroline Chester's rendering of the map. Here's the original. It's almost a tracing. I mean, the level of attention here. Every part of the map is copied verbatim and in the most finely grained manner from the original, down to the annotations she has about Native Americans in the Illinois and Indiana territories. Okay. And this is what she tells us in her diary, her first entry from June. Mary showed us her large map of Asia, which she had just finished in one of the United States. Both showed how much persevering industry joined with a large share of patience will accomplish. She wants to draw a map. July, drawing on my map. August. The morning was devoted to drawing on my map, an employment of which I am very fond. Mid-August, worked on my map until 4. Late August, worked on my map. Wrote and drew on my map. I once heard a gentleman remark that he had seen patience advertised for sale, and if I ever have the pleasure of seeing him again, I will petition him to purchase me a large quantity, for I know no person who stands so much in need of it as myself. September, I am quite tired of drawing on my map. And no wonder, right? I mean, I hope I've given you some of the sense in these crops and details of the degree to which this isn't, Mary and I might differ about this, but this isn't necessarily about geography, right? So you begin to wonder, well, what is it about? It might be about keeping those first generation of schoolgirls occupied in long days. After the Revolution, the school day for boys and girls was lengthened. That's a lot of time. If you have kids, if you've been to school, you know what I mean. It takes a lot to keep little hands busy. You have one very similar in your own collection that I spent a lot of time with today. I apologize for the quality of the photo, but it hasn't been digitized yet. But this is a map that was out in the lobby if you saw it. An unfinished map at precisely the same time period. We don't know anything about it, unsigned, exactly the same vignettes, you can see, replicated here. And just to give you a close-up, Mary took this for me. I know it's very hard to see, but this is the young student's map. The cartouche is here. This is unfinished, but you can see the lines on where he was about to go take the next step of signing his map. And that's something that's really interesting about all of these. Not every single one, I should have said most of these. Almost all of them are signed. They're signed because they're meant to be seen. They're meant to be judged and evaluated. They are akin to works of art. And I think that's something that is easy to overlook. When I first started looking at these, I would just pay attention to the name and move on. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought what an important act it is to assign your name to something. And if you go back to those merit badges, you can see why. These young girls and young boys were culminating toward that moment of performance at the end of the year when they would be judged. And 19th century education was all about judgment and evaluation, right? And handing out prizes and sort of sorting, right, who was the best and who was meritorious, if you will. By the 1820s, I think I've mentioned to you that there are inexpensive atlases on the market, making it easier in some ways for these students to copy things, and you see a proliferation of maps in the 1820s. At the same time, that development of slightly inexpensive atlases and school materials will eventually be the undoing of this. Because by the 1840s, you can buy pre-made maps that are blank, fill in, right? You've probably all had some experience with those as a child yourself. So the degree to which this is a product of a very particular moment in time in printing and education and the nation itself, I think cannot be overstated. Here's an anonymous map. I like this one because it's so very typical of the era. Apologize, I don't have the date up here. 1821. Right? And I want to show you, if you just keep your eye on the screen, again, they continue to copy very, very closely. This is one of the most commonly accessed maps of the United States in the 1820s made by Jedediah and his son Sidney Morse. Very, very inexpensive, very easy to access. So many of the maps that you see in the 1820s look like this, if the student maps, that is. Here's one from your collection. I like this very much because this is pre-conservation, and the woman, Julia, her last name, the conservator? Freemuth, thank you. Has done extraordinary work in relaxing the paper and fixing this. So this is a very poor scan, but if I can zoom in here. The United States executed by Hannah French at the New Hampton Female Seminary in 1830. But Hannah French, like the one I just showed you, paid incredible care and attention, I should say, to copying the original as closely as possible. Okay? So now that I've given you a sense of what these look like, I want to tell you why, to me, they're so important and consequential. And that has to do with Vermont. So Kevin, are you still here? Don't leave. Stay awake. And that has to do with a series of penmanship journals I have come across in the last few years. And some real serendipity. I guess I'm grateful to some families for keeping them in their basement for 150 years. On the West Coast, a few years ago, I found this, Frances Henshaw's Book of Penmanship, executed at the Middlebury Female Academy in 1823. On the left, I found something at the Osher Map Library in Maine, so the opposite end of the country. Harriet Baker's Book of Penmanship maps at Mr. Dunham's school in Windsor, Vermont. Mr. Dunham established his school in the 18-teens. It quickly became the place to send your young daughter if you were living in the Northeast. I want to show you what's going on in these penmanship journals. These were very, very common exercises in the teens and 20s. There's a third one that I found that'll be important in a moment. Catherine Cook's Book of Penmanship, photographed by my iPhone, sorry about that, at Mr. Dunham's school in Windsor, Vermont. So now we have two examples from the same school. And we have a third example that looks a lot like the other two. And they're all about the same time, 1818, 1819, 1823. Okay? Now what's going on in these penmanship journals? These were elaborate journals, quite literally, some of 40 and 50 pages, page after page of young girls practicing their penmanship, just like they say. Copying passages on Columbus, or astronomical geography, right, or the West. But always with an eye on practicing their hand. The most important manual for penmanship in this period was Eliezer Huntington's Art of Penmanship, which is from 1816, but this is the 1819 reprint. And if you pay attention, you'll see all the motifs and the styles that Huntington has set down in his textbook showing up in these penmanship journals. So let me show you. The different styles of hand. What you've got here in all the penmanship journals are what are called word maps. So do you see they've got United States at the middle, and what's above that? Canada. What's below that? Florida. That is to say, they're practicing their geography spatially. Very, very common practice in this period. But all using Huntington's motifs, right, and styles. This was a very, very common textbook. Other types of things. Arranging information in interesting ways, visual and graphic ways, almost like quilt work, right? You can see the way that they're doing this here, describing Kentucky, right, which is bordered in certain ways, right, and using little graphics to maybe keep herself awake. Here, Vermont, which is bordered by Canada, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, New York. You get the idea. Page after page of these things. Here's Huntington's title page, sometimes very explicitly copying these things. Right? When I first began to see this, I thought, wow, they're all paying attention to Huntington, right? This text must have been circulating. The more and more time I spend with these journals and maps of these students, and the more time I think about all these schools, particularly in that Connecticut River Valley, I begin to realize that Huntington might be growing out of that tradition. In other words, he's there in Hartford. Hartford is the epicenter of this educational creativity. It's where all the really cool, cutting-edge people, the reformers, the antebellum reformers, are breaking new ground with what their students can learn. Okay? It's the culture that will generate someone like, I'm blanking on his name, the father of public education. Horace Mann. Okay. And so in a way, we've kind of got the reverse going on, that it's the culture of graphic learning that might be influencing someone like Huntington. After all, he's producing his textbook in the late 18-teens when this kind of stuff has been going on for decades. So it sort of begins to challenge our notions of where the cues are coming from and how these learning techniques, how these school books are being produced. To some degree, it's the student culture that is generating a certain type of idea. I want to show you just a couple more examples. Again, creatively, some might say, rigidly, arranging information. These are two different. This is Harriet Baker and this is Henshaw, but doing very, very similar things at schools that are 100 miles apart, which makes you begin to think that these students, they're not working from a manual. They're learning from teachers who have themselves been trained in a certain way. In other words, the students become teachers who then go out and replicate certain types of practices, all of which are in service to memorization. The goal of all of this is for students to memorize and to develop what was then called mental discipline, right? Thinking that that was the faculty that you wanted to be strongest in your mind, is can you memorize? Again, the arrangement, very rigid. I'm sorry to go on about these journals, but I think they really give us some clues to how things are looking. And then after they've done all this penmanship, all three of those journals turn toward the maps. Right? So we see the student maps as part of this larger corpus of penmanship journals in the teens and 20s. This is one of my favorites by Catherine Cook in 1818. I don't think I have a detail here, but you can see not as precise as others. And this is, I'm sorry to, I didn't make this clear. This is essentially the size of a composition book, a little bit larger, but not much. These are quite small. Okay. And then I want to show you how similar. These are the three journals. They all have maps of Connecticut. But look at how similar some of the execution is, right? The emphasis on penmanship, the look, right, of the layout. This is Harriet Baker's, so precise that it almost looks like it's been engraved. I mean, it's really quite something. And this is Catherine Cook's here. which she's, again, dated and signed, right? That you're seeing these practices replicate in distant areas, and you begin to see that they're part of a larger trend, a larger pattern. And again, there's no master book for this. That is to say, the teachers are bringing the techniques to the students themselves. One thing that brought that really squarely home to me was this 1825 map made by Juliana Carpenter. Juliana Carpenter was a student at the Cortland Female Academy in New York, in Homer, New York. And if just notice a couple things. This was added later, by the way, just to make it clear. But especially this. On many of the double hemisphere, you see the space given to botanical illustrations. The map is not anything particularly special, which again makes you wonder, is this about geography or is this about something else? But the mother lode for me in this map is up here. So here's the added little portrait. Juliana Carpenter, age 26 years when she passed away, painted by her sister. But over here, Miss Juliana, thank you, Miss Juliana Carpenter, a premium for composition from her preceptress, her teacher, Caroline Hale. Caroline Hale had been educated at Mr. Dunham's school in Vermont, right? So you begin to see the way in which these women develop their ideas and then go on to do pretty much the one thing they could do off the farm and outside the home, and that was teach. The more you begin to look at these with detail, the more a sense you get that what we're really talking about here is a kind of sea change in American education, where women are teaching women, and men as well. There are some crucial male reformers here, but they're taking those ideas and spreading them to all corners of the country. It is true that many of these girls are educated in a certain area, in the Connecticut River Valley, or in the Baltimore area, or in area around Washington, D.C. But from there, they are sent all over the place. And these female academies proliferate. Even if they don't last, there are hundreds and hundreds of them around the country. And that's what I want to turn my attention to last here. So if you just give me a few more minutes, I'll get through this. Get through this. It sounds like, let me get through this. I began by telling you a little bit about Emma Willard, who was a crucial female educator arguing for the expansion of the curriculum for young women. She took the helm of the Litchfield Female Academy in 1816. From there, she started her own school, the Troy Female Seminary, which is now the Emma Willard School for Girls, still a very well-respected educational institution. Emma Willard grew up in this Litchfield Female Academy world. Right? She may have chafed at all this, but she did the painting and the embroidery and the performance like everybody else did at about 1800. She also mastered it, meaning she thought she was pretty damn good at all this stuff. She thought she was better than your average bear, in part because she said, I studied geometry. I was better at geometry than anybody else in my class. I was better at geometry than my teacher was. And she said, she thought that this education in what she called perspective and drawing, right, gave her a kind of mental edge. What she was beginning to think about here when she took over that school in 1816 was that geography was not being taught the way it should be. Most geography texts had no maps, and that was a function of printing. It was too expensive, right? But she says, if you're just reading text in one ear, out the other, you need some way to make it stick. And for her, what she was good at was drawing. And so what she began to do was to rebel against the received wisdom of copying a map, and instead move her students towards something different, which may not sound progressive, but hear me out. For her, you don't copy a map, you draw a map from memory. Right? That's the shift that she makes. And so here we have Eliza Henshaw, Frances Henshaw's older sister, that you saw just a minute ago, at Mrs. Willard's Middlebury Female Academy in 1816. This is just a page from Eliza Henshaw's journal, again copied from a standard history text. But here is the key. I apologize, I could never find out who bought this, so I just took a screenshot. But she's having young Eliza draw from memory. Now, those maps may look the same, and for all intents and purposes, they are the same. But what I'm trying to get at here is that even though Willard is rebelling against this constricted, rigid female education centered on accomplishment, she's also thoroughly growing out of it. That is to say, it's the graphic education that she grew up with that she brings and updates and adapts. So let me tell you why Willard is so important. Willard then hires Miss Young Henshaw to be her assistant to draw a series of maps for Willard's own History of the United States, one of the first history textbooks published in the United States. It is also the first historical atlas published in the country. Emma Willard publishes the first historical atlas in the United States in 1828, and Eliza helps her with the maps. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the maps, but part of what makes them interesting is the way in which here, this is her first map or introductory map. It's about Aboriginal wandering, is what she calls it, prehistory, Native history. And we can quibble about her closed-mindedness regarding Native Americans. But what's interesting to me about this, I think I have a detail, is what she's doing is collapsing centuries into one page. She's talking about migration, right? And it's limited, and it's generalized, and it's, you can see that she's, in the text, she's more than excited about the way Indians are then swept off, whether through plague or through removal, right? She's thoroughly American and thoroughly jingoistic about manifest destiny. But at the same time, there's something about this graphic education that I think prepares her to experiment with historical mapping. Here's just another example. The first map of 1578, for her, when things really get started, right? The failed grants of Gilbert and Humphrey, or Gilbert and Raleigh, pardon me, and the way in which the different empires are sending their ships across the country. So the historical atlas is hers, and she's quite proud to be a female who made the first one. But what she's really famous for, sorry about this, is her graphic innovations. Trees of Time, where you have the history of the United States drawn onto a map. I'm sorry, drawn onto a graphic, drawn onto an image. Anything, she says, to aid the mind, to aid memory. So she's still quite traditional, if you will. Memory is still for her the most important goal of education. But for her, the way to get there is to play with graphic knowledge. And that, I think, is partly what's interesting and the innovative part about what she does. I want to just show you one commentary. We don't have to go through all of this. But this is a commentary by her sister-in-law, who's a very, very well-known reformer, Elmira Phelps, educational reformer. Just want to draw your attention to a couple things here. Within the last 15 years, so this is 1833, the present method of teaching geography by maps has been introduced. She's saying, yeah, since about the War of 1812, there's been a lot of ways in which we've seen maps introduced into the female classroom. For some time after geographies were accompanied with atlases, no attempt was made to teach the drawing of maps, except in a laborious and unprofitable manner. It occupied weeks and even months, with little advantage than giving to the pupil neatness of execution. And this is what she's rebelling against. All these maps that I've shown you. The method consisted of delineating maps upon paper, coloring and printing them. They had a very pretty appearance. But as they were often drawn by tracing on paper laid over the original, the mind of the pupil was too intent on the mechanical performance to think of the relative situation of places. In other words, there was so much attention to reproducing the map that the ideas of geography were lost. A young lady spending 3 months at a boarding school and having drawn and painted a map was considered as well versed in geography, though in truth, she might be almost as ignorant of the science as the material on whose surface her map had been delineated. She's no smarter than a sheet of paper. And then she goes on to talk about how wonderful Emma Willard is, and Emma Willard was a consummate promoter of herself and her textbooks. extolling Emma Willard, who had this new teaching of geography through maps, which I showed you through Eliza Henshaw. She had no books which contained her plan and taught her pupils from her own manuscripts. She made great use of maps in every recitation. The point of Phelps's critique here is, quite obviously, she's promoting her sister's work. But she's also trying to differentiate Willard from that past type of education, too traditional, right? The maps that we prize and we have come to love in the last few years and have been coveted by dealers across the country and in Europe was very much a part of a particular time in a particular place, right? Superseded very quickly by Willard and other innovators in the 20s and 30s, like Joseph Emerson and William Woodbridge, all from that Connecticut River Valley, all saying, no, 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 women don't need to copy maps. Women need to think about what geography actually is, which in their mind was just as much about memory, but perhaps less about rigid, precise execution of maps. And so you get to something more like this. So to sum up, I just want to make two points clear about what I think is going on in these maps. They are charming, and they are folkloric, and they are intoxicating. I have become obsessed. But if you look at them in toto, and for me, what's so thrilling to be at the Clements is that I had seen some of this material digitized, but to see it in person and to see all the things that Brian and others are collecting, the more you begin to see, the more these maps surface, you begin to see more and more pieces of this puzzle. So not only do we have a better and better sense of what these young girls were doing day to day in the early republic for the first time in this country, right? Being educated formally. But collectively, if you step back and you see the patterns, you begin to draw larger conclusions about the phase of education that they're going through, what had come before it, and what would replace it afterwards. So to sum up, I hope I've made the case that these are not just one-offs, right? But they give you a sense of the degree to which map drawing was essential to American education, particularly female education, from the Revolution to the 1840s. Thank you.
So at this point, we're going to open up the floor for questions.
Wonderful talk. Why does the state of Michigan always look so bad in these maps? I'm really offended by this.
There's someone else who's offended, Mary.
I mean, was it that hard to do? I mean, Florida looks fine, the coastline.
It's super hard.
But Florida looks fine. Is it a coastline problem?
Do you mean why is it so
Why is
long?
Michigan just so distorted? But the other states are always pretty close. But Michigan is never even close.
I have to say that's the one question I didn't prepare for, but I should have because I was coming here.
They hadn't surveyed.
Maybe that's. Please go ahead.
That came later, Orange Risbon.
Do you want to? Please go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say they hadn't surveyed Michigan. Mm-hmm. It was late, that was very, very late, around 1825 or so, before it got surveyed. The width, they didn't know the width of the state for many, many years.
So, to push the point further, perhaps on the original maps, it's.
Yeah, it didn't get surveyed till really late, and around the 1820s.
Okay. I don't have a good answer for you. I'm sorry. That's a great question, though. I'll go and investigate.
You could probably do, somebody could be very creative and do a morphing of that. Mm-hmm. Of the outline of the state and through the cadastral surveys and everything to the current image that we have of Michigan. I've never seen that.
Surely there must be an atlas of Michigan with such hometown pride, right?
Thanks so much for your wonderful talk. You touched on a theme that I wonder if you could develop a little bit more, and that is the theme of nationalism. After the War of 1812, there's this great burst of nationalism in poetry and prose and in Hudson River School of Art that develops in the mid-20s and flourishes for 50 years. And then also in the American language, you have Noah Webster
Yes.
trying to rescue the English language from the English and turn it into something, as he sees it, purer and more noble, that is to say, the American version. And I noticed in some of the writing, the language had already developed into the American version.
Yes,
in terms of
absolutely.
spelling.
Yep.
And I wondered if you could comment on a possible impact of Noah Webster on the maps and on the writings about the maps. And also a little bit later, you have McGuffey, William Holmes McGuffey, with his marvelous, it turns out, scores of millions of McGuffey readers. And I wondered if you could comment on that burst of nationalism and whether it augmented or in some ways perhaps replaced some of these very fine efforts on the part of these young women and young men. And again, thank you so much.
Oh, sure. I'm going to start with the end first because that is an easy way to get to the beginning. McGuffey's readers, which, as you know, flood the market during and after the Civil War, they make it unnecessary to create one's own materials. So they are a tremendous advance in terms of the expense, right? Rural America, access to literacy. But what they do is they make it no longer necessary to create one's own materials. And I think, if I'm correct, and Mary and I have talked about this, that's partly what's going on in this era when these maps flourish, is that students are being assigned this, but they're also creating their own learning materials. There's just not that much out there, right? Now,
And McGuffey is well before the Civil War, too, in terms of the impact on learning.
Oh, well, thank you. Right. I always think of him in the height of the 70s. The second part, I think, is crucial. And in fact, for me, the way I came to these materials, when I first started finding them, I was mostly finding U.S. maps. I found a real spike after the War of 1812, like Caroline Chester, right? And then a spike that continues into the 20s. You're absolutely right. This is an era of unbridled patriotism, which is odd because we don't win the war, right? There's no territory exchange, right? That's correct, right. So by that measure, but that patriotism continues to augment a claim that Noah Webster and Jedediah Morse had made earlier, which is American students learn from American teachers, right? Make America great. Make America great for the first time. So Jedediah Morse, who's the father of American geography, one of the first authors of geography textbooks in the United States, says, I want to do for geography what Webster did for language, right? We don't learn from Europeans, and very quickly, to the extent that we can afford them, what you see these students copying is not European materials, but American materials. So I think you're absolutely right. That might also have to do with availability, right? I don't want to, but I do think your point about the degree to which these maps are, among other things, a way for students to inhabit the country. I mean, if you think about these American maps, a young girl, let's say she's in the frontier of Mississippi, she is drawing the country in the first few decades after the Revolution, and in some ways she is creating a sense of citizenship for herself, which of course is limited. She isn't a citizen, let's be frank about that, but she is part of the national body. And when you draw these maps, if you let me just riff for a minute, part of what you're doing is creating a sense of identity with areas you will never see and people you will never meet. American identity is a fiction. Any national identity is a fiction. It doesn't mean it's any less real to us and visceral, but it's invented. And these maps are the ground floor of that invention. So to draw a map is to create an identity. And to the extent that it's an American identity, right, that's pretty important in a new country where people still identified primarily as Virginians, right, or New Englanders, or Kentuckians. They didn't really have anything directly in common. Keep in mind how controversial the Revolution was, and how failed the Articles were, and how partisan and ugly. If you feel bad about your country now, I'm not saying you should, But take a look at the 1790s. You'll feel better, right? I mean, they're about to rip each other's throats out.
Aside from Emma Willard's map on Native Americans and their migration and everything, did you run across any other maps or commentary of the young ladies in that time period discussing Native Americans?
Oh, great question. You mean in the maps or in their journals?
Commentary or
yes.
penmanship or anything?
Yep.
Anything about anecdotal information about their experience with Indians or knowledge of Indians?
Yes, and you saw Melvin Wright. He had one of his vignettes was the, how does he put it, the Aboriginals of Vermont. Mm-hmm. Clearly taken as, where's Kevin? Taken from a text. Oh, the Zadok Thompson's Atlas of History of Vermont. Yeah, so he's copying from an existing one. And the same with the penmanship journals. What you're largely seeing is young women copying histories of America, ethnographies, geographies. So it's not original to them, the language, but they're inscribing it, right, to learn about it. So they're usually talking about the different Indian nations, and the story is generally that they move off the stage. Right.
I was afraid at first this would be tangential, but it seems to have come up in a way. You talked about how the popularity of the War of 1812 was a factor in the interest in map drawing and making and so on. I never got the impression the War of 1812 was very popular. It may be, I don't know, that there was a surge in nationalism and patriotism afterward, but my impression is War of 1812 was very controversial, not widely supported, especially in New England and in border areas.
Absolutely, you're absolutely right. The sense that the war hawks had pushed Monroe.
Mr. Madison's War.
Thank you. Mr. Madison's War. The patriotism I was talking about was after the treaty in 1815, when there is a general sense of I would say, patriotism. I would certainly not dispute what you just said, that for the duration of the war and the year leading up to it, it was enormously controversial and needless, as the Federalists put it. And they were vicious in decrying what they thought was a Democrats' engineered war to grab land.
Was it a coincidence that the Hartford Convention was in Hartford?
Right. And keep in mind, this is where the original gerrymander, right, is right on the eve of the war. The Federalists sort of decrying what they think the Republicans have done. Yeah.
Do you have any example? Have you come across any examples from the South with these kind of maps?
Yes, and the gathering at the very beginning when I had 4 on a couple slides, the earliest map I found is from South Carolina, 1785. And I know that they are earlier. I just haven't found them yet. Many from Baltimore, a few from Mississippi, but I haven't found the number. And I think the explanation is simply the number of academies. There are so many in the North. The other example is the Capitol, which was fairly progressive in developing these female seminaries. So they are. The best repository for these is MESDA. Where is MESDA located again? The Southeast Decorative Arts Organization. Yes, and they've digitized them. Yes.
Did the educators in the early part of the century ever break out the surveying equipment and get the girls outside?
That's what's so interesting to me, is that boys and girls are both learning mapping. The boys are going outside, and the girls are staying inside. That's not to say that they weren't. There's a novel from, it's not Cather, it's much earlier, but someone has pointed me toward a novel of the early Ohio frontier that has an example of a scene where girls are outside surveying. But by and large, that was the domain of male education. And surveying was central, right? Whereas the girls were staying inside. All right. Thank you so much for coming.